Well, we turn our attention to the book of Haggai again, and we read there in the second chapter, beginning at verse 10, and we'll read to the end of verse 17. So Haggai chapter 2, starting at verse 10 and reading to the end of verse 19. This is what the prophet Haggai says. On the 24th day of the 9th month, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priest what the law says. If a person carries consecrated meat in the fold of his garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew or some wine, oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? And the priest answered, no. Then Haggai said, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? Yes, the priest replied, it becomes defiled. Then Haggai said, so it is with this people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do, whatever they offer there is defiled. Now, give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before this stone was laid one on another in the Lord's temple. When anyone came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew, and hail, yet you did not turn to me, declares the Lord. From this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. There once was a young girl who, with her family, was forced to move around from place to place. And eventually, as she went through all these moves, she came of age and decided that the best way to help her family was to become a school teacher. And so she became a school teacher and was able to give some of that income to helping her family, who were always on the move. After a few years, she met a man who would eventually become her husband. And so she quit teaching, got married, and began to help her husband, who was a farmer. Tragedy was to follow her for many years after that. She had a young son, her second child. Her son died at 12 days of age. Her husband contracted a disease that left him partially paralyzed, which caused a great deal of difficulty. Her eldest daughter accidentally set their family home on fire, and they lost everything. A fire under mysterious circumstances started in their farm barn, and so all their crops and their equipment were lost. It seemed that for her there were difficulty and tragedy everywhere. When she was 43 years old, her daughter encouraged her to write about her family experiences, encouraged her to write a memoir about her childhood. And so she wrote her first autobiography and submitted it to the publisher, and it was rejected. And it was to be rejected numerous times over the next couple of decades. But she was determined to succeed. And so she kept writing and rewriting it. And eventually the publishers decided it was okay to publish as a series of fictional stories for young children. And so it was that at 65 years of age, Laura Ingalls Wilder published her first book, which was Little House in the Big Woods. She wrote other little series in her Little House series, and then she did so until the age of 76. Laura Ingalls, I can't even say this word, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who became famous, one of my wife's favorite television shows, Little House on the Prairie. She had a dream that was given to her by her daughter when she was already middle-aged, about the same age I am now, and it didn't work out. But she pursued that dream, and she pursued that dream, and she kept on pursuing it until it became a reality. There's many objects sometimes, or many paths in life that maybe we long for, that we pursue with a doggedness. The question is holiness one of them? Is holiness one of them? One of those things that we set our minds on to pursue. What would we be willing to give up? What would we be willing to change? What would we be willing to dedicate ourselves to in the pursuit of being a people who are holy before our God? Now, the topic over our last couple of weeks has been on stewardship, the idea of what we possess and what we have and how we give that. In order to accomplish that series, we've been looking at this little book of Haggai. And just to remind you, this is actually part of a much larger series that we've been doing all the way through 2018, as our theme for 2018 has been First Baptist Church as a worshiping community. And so we've structured our worship services, the themes of them, since the beginning of 2018, like a worship service. The very first month together, we considered what it meant to be a people that were called to worship. And then what it means to be a people who invoke the presence of God, which we did in February together. What it means to be a people who confess our sins before God and why we do it in our worship services. What it means in a series of 3 series we did starting after Easter, and being a people who praise God. And now we come to this part of our year together, what it means to be a people who are good stewards of what God has given us. And so we turned our attention to the book of Haggai, because Haggai had to speak into a generation who had kind of lost their way as far as their priority and stewardship went. Here it is, 520 BC, and they've come back many of them have come back from living in exile. God had decreed through the prophets that he would cast judgment upon his people because his people had lost their way. And that had transpired back in 587. The people had been given over to their enemies, the Babylonians, and been carried off into exile. And so here it was, almost 70 years later, the people have begun the journey back to the promised land, and they've come back to this land that was very much devastated by the war that had taken place 2 generations before. And they started the process of rebuilding their lives. And they had made some definite progress in rebuilding their lives, coming back to this land that was devastated. But now 16 years have passed, and they've kind of lost their set of priorities. They may have come back for wonderful reasons, probably very spiritual reasons, and then they got there and trying to rebuild their lives and put so much effort into that they lost their way a little bit. And so the prophet Haggai comes along in his first message and asks the people how they fared. How have things gone for you? And of course the answer was, not as well as we expect. I believe it's Dave Ramsey who sometimes uses the expression on his show, work too hard to be this poor. And that's what they were experiencing in the land. They worked too hard to be as poor off as they were. And Haggai comes along and says, well, there's a reason for that, because you haven't got your priorities straight. You focused on rebuilding your lives, and then your thought was, once I get to a certain stage, once I get to a certain stage of abundance, I'll be able to give God from my abundance. And Haggai says that's not the way it works in God's kingdom. It's like an upside-down kingdom. Instead, you give God the due first, and then he brings the abundance. And in Haggai's generation, he said, your focus needs to be on rebuilding the temple, the center of your worship life together. Rebuild the temple, get your priorities straight, and see what God is able to do. Now, unlike most of the prophets in the Old Testament, Haggai had the opportunity to see people actually get cut to the heart and respond to his message in a positive way. And rebuild the temple they began to do. Now, it wasn't very fancy. It was, the illustration I used over the last few weeks, it's like Dagwood from the Blondie comics. He's not a very good carpenter, but he does his best. Well, that's what they were able to do. They were able to put together a structure, but it wasn't what they expected it to be or what they desired it to be. In fact, it was a pale representation of all the stories they had heard about the first temple and how fabulous it was and how everything was overlaid in gold. They just didn't have the resources to do that, and they were disappointed. And along comes Haggai with his second message. And his second message is, what you've done is enough. You've started this process. You've started to get your life in order and your priorities in order. Now trust me that I'll do the rest. Wonderful words from the beginning of chapter 2. The silver is mine, declares the Lord. The gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. Don't worry about overlaying with gold. I'll do that in my own time. You've done your part. Now allow me to do mine. Well, now we come to this third passage, this third message in the book of Haggai. And the people have done their part. They've begun to build the building. And now Haggai comes along with a little different message, and it has to do with holiness. See, the temple has continued to go up. They've continued the work of putting the temple together. People's confidence is up, and Haggai's been a big part of that because he's been encouraging them. And now he goes one step further. They've dealt with the exterior things, and now Haggai says it's time to deal with some of the interior things. Not of the building, but of the heart. And so he asks the priest first a series of questions, and it has all to do with holiness, which may seem like a foreign concept to us, but for the Israelites it was very important. So they asked this question about if someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment. So for the Israelites, consecrated meat was meat that had been blessed. And the Israelites understood more or less three categories of holiness. On the one side, you had things that are holy, things that were used for God's purposes, much like Gina's children's story. Certain things had certain purposes, and those that were holy were set aside for holy purposes. And so, for instance, the illustration they're giving is meat, carrying meat in the fold of your garment. But there's a second category, and that's what most things fell into, and those things were the normal things, things that were used for everyday use. They were neither good nor bad, they were simply used. Then on the other side, you had the third category, and those were the unclean things, the things that had come in contact with dead bodies or things that had certain types of mold attached to them. And those were the things that were to be excluded as best as they could from the community of people who sought to be God's people. And so the question is, if I carry some sort of consecrated meat in the fold of my garment, and I walk along and I touch something else with it, is the holiness of this meat transmitted to this table? Now, they have to ask the priest this question because this is a very priestly type question. And the priests, according to Haggai, say, no. The answer is no. Just because I carry something that's holy, if it comes in contact with something that's normal, does it transmit its holiness to the normal thing? And the answer is no, it doesn't do that. But then he asks them a second question. And the second question has to do with one who comes in contact with an unclean body, a dead body. If the person who's come in contact with a dead body and is therefore unclean, this third category, if they begin to touch different things, does it make those things unclean? Now again, this would be a priest-type question. And the answer is yes. Because uncleanness, for the Jewish understanding, was able to be transmitted to other things. And that's why things that were unclean had to be separated from the community. So if I was going into the temple and I was going to offer a sacrifice, let's say I was to sacrifice my sacred eye, and I had the choice of 3 knives, or maybe a goat instead, and I had the choice of 3 knives. I had a knife that was set aside for the purposes of sacrificing, and I had a knife that was just my everyday normal knife that I used in my home, and then I had a knife that had been used to perform an autopsy. Which of those knives should I use? Well, if I use the holy knife, I've done what's right. If I use the normal knife, I've done something improper, but not devastating. It's just a normal knife that I've used. But if I chose that other one that had touched a dead body, when things that are unclean come in contact with things that are holy, that causes the wrath of God in the Hebrew understanding to burst out. That was absolutely unacceptable to do. And this is what Haggai is trying to get the priest to think through, but through the priest to get the people to think through. They're doing what they're supposed to do, and Haggai's been very encouraging for them. They've been building the temple, which is what they're supposed to do. And they're beginning the process of putting God first in their lives, which is what Haggai had asked them to do. But the external actions, the external things that they're taking care of, now they need to appreciate how the internal things, their own actions and attitudes of the heart are going to affect those other things that they've been now giving their attention to. Haggai now in this passage begins to warn them and encourage them that not only do they have to do the right actions, but they have to make sure that their their lives before God, their holiness, also gets in alignment. Because if it doesn't, then all the actions that they do on God's behalf are going to be tainted by their own unholiness or uncleanness. It's not only a matter of just doing the right things that they're told to do by the prophet, but about getting their own houses in order to make sure that the actions they're undertaking on God's behalf come from the right place in their lives. In this illustration, Haggai is not only concerned about the face of what they do, but how the people's lives are arranged behind what they do. And that's the next thing that Haggai turns his attention to, is the holiness. Are people paying attention to how they live their lives in the everyday so that what they do in their worship time is not affected by that? Here, he speaks of this concept of holiness, and Paul uses similar language. Now, for us, of course, as believers, our holiness is not dictated on sort of the rules of what we eat, or whether we come in contact with certain molds, or whether we arrange our lives around certain ritualistic categories. That's not what we've been called to. But the idea of holiness comes just as much into the New Testament as it does often in the Old Testament. Paul uses the illustration of the Christian life being like an athletic contest. It's not just enough to put on a pair of shorts and to put on a t-shirt and say, I've done my exercise for the day. It actually requires getting out there and doing something with your shorts and t-shirt and running shoes on. The doctor isn't going to be happy with me if I say, yes, I wore my athletic clothes for 90 minutes a day, but I sat around and ate chips. It's not only about looking the part, but then being the part. And so for the Christian, it's about almost like a race. Paul uses the illustration of the Christian life as like running a race. And so we pursue God. We pursue holiness. We begin to arrange our lives around following his purposes, which is what you do so often. I mean, here you are in worship service on a beautiful Sunday morning. There's a trip you could be taking. There's something at the house that you could be cleaning, because I know I have a few things that need to be cleaned. We could be doing those things, but instead you've arranged your life and you set aside this time to be in worship together. We're going to have men's and women's Bible study starting next week on Sunday evening, and many of you will set aside that time to come and study the Bible together, kind of a special series. But again, there's other things I know that you could be doing. You put an offering in the offering plate. You could be doing so many things with that money, but instead you give it to the work of our church together and our missions together. You've arranged your lives so often around pursuing God's purposes. And that's what Haggai is calling the people of his generation to. That's what Paul called the people of his generation to. And that's what Scripture continues to call us to making sure that we don't just do the right things so we look the part, but we pursue God in the times when no one sees so that we can be the people that he's called us to be. You know, that's why Financial Peace University, we used it today as kind of our giving time, because that's important, getting our financial houses in order so that we're able to be generous when we see a need arising. That's an important part of our life together. Having discipline, not just to attend worship services, but the other part of our lives, the pocketbooks that no one sees, is that being conducted in a way that's honoring to God, conducted according to his purposes, so we're ready to respond to his leading. That's a part of living the holy life as well. Haggai and his generation had to remind them that it's not just about the actions that they do in public, not just about building the temple building, but the life of holiness that lies behind it. And that continues to be a call for our generation, continues to be the call of Christ, that we're living a life and pursuing a life that in all of its facets honors God, so then the public way that we live our life matches the private way that we conduct ourselves when no one else is watching. And that's a part of the pursuit of holiness. And that's the difficult part. Haggai ends with his message there, with an encouragement to Zerubbabel, the end passage that we didn't read, that there's still more to be done. And Zerubbabel, you keep on the good work that's been started around you. And I think that would be what Haggai would say to us in our generation. We've started a good work, moving in a good direction, both as a people of God And as individuals, in your pursuit of holiness in your contest, keep it going, because it matters how we finish. And my prayer for you and for me is that in this week, that our pursuit will be pure, that we'll keep up the good work and keep running the good race, we'll keep up the good fight. And the things that we do together then, the things we touch, the things we contribute to, they will be blessed because God will be honored, not just in the service we pay Him, not just in the things that we do that everyone sees, but because our lives are given in honor to Him day in and day out.